Bueno, entonces demos comienzo a nuestro seminario. El día de hoy tenemos un invitado muy especial, es el profesor Didier Fassan, que es profesor de Ciencias Sociales del Instituto de Estudios Avanzados de la Universidad de Princeton, profesor del College de France y director de estudios de la Escuela de Estudios Superiores en Ciencias Sociales de París, y diría yo uno de los más reconocidos sociólogos, para ponerle algún título, de la actualidad. El profesor Fassan muy amablemente ha aceptado charlar con nosotros hoy y quiere discutir con nosotros un artículo reciente que publicó en una línea de trabajo que él ha venido desarrollando en los últimos años. El artículo en concreto se trata sobre, o se titula Las políticas de las secuelas, sobre las secuelas de la violencia policial. Va a ser una presentación de unos 15 o 20 minutos sobre algunos aspectos centrales del artículo y después haremos apertura a las preguntas y comentarios de la audiencia. Bienvenido, profesor Fasán, es un placer tenerlo con nosotros, y también bienvenido Daniel, que es mi amigo y colega con quien realizamos este seminario.
Muchas gracias por su invitación y sus palabras. Muchas gracias a Manuel Alejandro Iturralde y a Daniel Eduardo Bonilla. Es un placer, un gran placer para mí estar con ustedes. Voy a presentar mi ponencia o no será realmente una ponencia, sino una pequeña charla alrededor del artículo que le he mandado. Lo voy a hacer en inglés, pero podemos después tener ah, los, las preguntas y comentarios en español para los que prefieren y voy a ver si puedo contestar en español o en inglés. Um, Casi no tengo oportunidades de hablar español y por eso me parece un poco difícil de presentar directamente en este idioma y de todas formas ustedes han leído el artículo en inglés. Entonces, now now I will switch to English. Um, as you may know, my work on police and policing, which goes back to the mid 2000s. So I worked between 2005 and 2007 doing an ethnography during 15 months of the police and special units operating in the barrios populares in the poor neighborhoods in the area of Paris. And so my work has been mostly ethnographic, but was on first of all on the police, as I just said, and meaning that I was not doing interviews, but I was sort of living with the police at different moments of day and night, and going out with them. I did a sort of similar work of participant observation in courts, especially immediate appearance trials, where some cases correspond precisely to the police prosecuting or asking for prosecution of young people, mostly from ethno-racial minorities. And I did complementary work, which is more than complementary because it was 4 years of ethnography of a short stay prison in France also. So I tried at a certain moment in my academic life to work from an ethnographic perspective, that is by spending a lot of time in a given place and with given officers or judges or guards on the police, on the justice system, and on the correctional institution. And this gave me a sort of ethnographic understanding of what we can call the repressive part of the state. Before that, I had worked on a completely different aspect, which was the humanitarian work. And for me, both the humanitarian and the repressive were part of a broader project, intellectual project that I had, or that I progressively built, which I called political and moral anthropology of the state. But what I have presented in this paper is a case study, a very well-known news item, something that happened and became very much in the media for several weeks. And even, I would say, even now, if you speak of the death of Nael, which is the first name of the young man who was killed by the police, everyone knows in France who is this Nael young man and what happened that day. So it's a very famous and tragic case, which I have proposed to analyze. So it's different. It's not something that I've been observing, of course, but something I've been reflecting upon, which is a different kind of exercise for social scientists. And as you will have read the story, or rather you will have read the different narratives about the story, that of the police, that of the young men, and that coming out of the video that was filmed, but also the stories by the journalists and by the politicians. So there's a multiplication of discourses on the case, and I found that particularly interesting. And of course, it's not just discourses; it is discourses that have some implications for action and for policies. So precisely, the event, as you've seen, it was the starting point was what we call a refusal to comply to an order to stop for someone who is driving, and so there was some traffic violation that this young man did, and he did want to stop when the police asked him to do so because he didn't have a driving license, and he was afraid, and at some point he was stopped in his car, and that's when the two police officers on the side of the car shot at him. One of them shot at him in the thorax and killed him. But this there's a context to it, and the context is, as you've read, the fact that a few years before, a law had been passed on the proposal of the government, the Minister of the Interior at the time, to give the permission to the police to kill or to shoot, at someone, even if that person, even if the police is not in a situation of legitimate defense. As you know, as a general principle, the police is authorized to shoot at someone who would be threatening their life or threatening the life of someone else. But with this new law, it was possible for someone who would refuse to comply to an order of stopping his car or her car to shoot, even to shoot in the back, to shoot when the car was had gone through. And a study that was done after just before Niall's death showed that since the law had been passed, there had been a multiplication by 5 of the number of people being shot and killed as they refused to comply. And this was something specific to France. That was not the case in other countries. And this was also specific to comply to refusal to comply, since there were not more killing by the police for other violations of the law. So it was very specific. And so the authors of this study concluded that it was the multiplication by 5 of the death was the consequence of the passing of the law. But this is not, and I just want to add that this was part of an expansion, an extension of the prerogatives of the police that have been given to them by different governments from the right and from the left over the past decades. So they are allowed, they have permission to do more things that were until now unlawful. But this is not, I think it is important to remind what I just said and how much the law can transform the practices of policing, but also how the police can influence the making of the law. But this is not what I want what I wanted to develop in the article. It was my goal was to address things that are relatively less studied than when we speak of police violence. We have the circumstances, we have some of the causal or circumstantial elements, as I mentioned before, but there's less studies or less analysis of what happens afterwards. So that's why the article is about the politics of the aftermath. So there are 3 elements that I try to develop more specifically in that regard. The first one is the question of the forgery and perjury by the police, those who have killed, which are encouraged by the authorities and are accepted by the judges. So that's the first point, the forgery and perjury. The second point is the deceitful portrayal of the protagonist with these 2 symmetrical dimensions, praising perpetrators and blaming victims. And finally, when protests occur, the crackdown on these protests from the government and the authorities more generally, the condoning and the denying of police brutality. So I will not develop in detail these different aspects. You've read them. I want maybe just to insist on the difference between forgery and perjury. The forgery is to write false statement, and the perjury is the deceiving the court and cheating on the truth. and this is very banal. As you've seen in the United States, there's this expression that in a way is humorous, but in another way is problematic, which is lying, which means testifying and lying at the same time, which is considered to be typical of the work of the police. So every time the police have committed a violation of the law, there will be this kind of lying, that is lying while testifying about the facts. And of course, this is a tricky situation for the victims, because you have the word in court. You have the word of the police, who are sworn in agents of the state, against the word of very often young people, very often from disadvantaged neighborhoods, and very often from ethno-racial minorities, that is, Blacks and Arabs in France. So, of course, there's an unbalance here between the two, and the result is that very often it is the word of the police that is believed by the judges, and as I explain from my field work, the accusation of contempt and rebellion against an agent of the state, in that case against the police, has increased considerably in recent years with the support of the ministers of the Interior, which means that someone who is victim of brutality from the police will be accused by this police of having himself been violent, so that on the one hand, that the victim will be prosecuted for his violence, and on the other hand, the police will be considered innocent just responding to this violence. So that's the first element, and you've seen an example of how far the judges can go in believing the forged version of the police. You have the case of this woman who had an accident with a scooter, and she was a woman police officer, and she tells her parents by tweeting them what happened, and so the judge has the trace of that, but at the same time he has the counter discourse of the police officers who say that she was not driving, that she doesn't have anything to do with that, and in the end, she's declared innocent of the accident. So that's the first element. The second element is the deceitful portrayal of the protagonist, and you've seen in the case of Nael how the 30-year-old officer was described as a family man, as a very good policeman, irreproachable, extraordinary, seasoned, experienced, and that goes from his lawyer, and you can expect that from the lawyer, but also the Minister of the Interior and the Prefect of Police. So, but then when the journalists start to investigate, they discover that, in fact, he has been in a corrupt unit, then in a very violent special, another very special unit. And then I was also prosecuted for a crime, a sexual crime. So you have little by little, the truth about this man appears through the work of the journalist, but it is a completely different picture that was given by the by the authorities. And symmetrically, the 17-year-old adolescent Nael was described by the right-wing press and the and on social media as you read it, but well known to the police, long criminal record, school dropout, 15 offenses, etc., etc. And again, when some journalists investigated the case, he has only one case that was which was already a refusal to comply, for which he had an educational penalty. But not only his parents, but also his friends, his rugby professor, etc., show that or insist on the fact that he was this very nice young man that, of course, making some mistakes as someone of his age, but being certainly not being the wrongdoer and villain that the media were describing. In fact, the authorities overplay that, and they overplay, talking about France in particular, and in several cases of police being particularly violent, they've been awarded for their service record or even promoted to a higher position after having committed the brutality. And the last point is about the urban unrest and how this urban unrest has been responded by the authorities. So here, I think it is important to use the concept and to use it in a slightly different way, but the concept that the British historian E.P. Thompson has used, which is that of the moral economy of the crowd. And he's speaking about as you may know, about the peasants, the English peasants of the 17th, 18th century, who revolted against at the time, in several occasions, when there were violation of the social contract, that is, prices becoming extremely high, the cereals they produced not being bought at their right price, etc. So there would be at this moment a reaction that was violent and a form of revolt. And what is important for me is that, and something that on which E.P. Thompson was not very clear himself, which is the moral dimension of the moral economy. So it's not so much an economy in the financial or the typical economical dimension, but it is the moral dimension that is at stake. That is, when people think that the values on which they rely are not respected anymore. So if you think of these relatively poor neighborhoods and these discriminated ethno-racial communities, there's a certain level of injustice that is tolerated, that is accepted. But when it goes too far, when someone gets killed, then there's a sort of a breaking of the social contract, and so this is when the crowd, or young people mostly, become themselves violent, so looting stores and attacking or burning cars, etc. And And the question is not, of course, to excuse or to, but it's simply to interpret and comprehend what's going on. But what has been really remarkable is how immediately the media and the authorities, when the starting point was the death of a young man who had not committed a crime, he had violated traffic laws, but not committed a crime. That suddenly there's a shift from the question of the violence of the police to the question of the violence of the crowd, and suddenly everything becomes about, in the media and the political discourse, about the revolts and their violence, and uh, and uh, and so that justifies the response of the police, extremely violent. You've seen that people have been killed, others have been very seriously wounded, including enucleated, losing one eye. Uh, Many of them not even being in the protests. Many of them being simply people who were going back from work, going to the store, walking around, maybe uh, looking at what was going on, but were not even protesting or throwing anything to the police. And some of them lost their lives or had other wounds. And this is something that has been increasing over the years in France, and not only in France. We've seen that also in the United States, how the police has become more authorized and legitimized to be violent, including against peaceful protesters, which was not necessarily the case here in Nile's case. Some of them were making destruction, but but the but that happens also with peaceful protesters. So in the end, what we see is this tension, from a broader perspective, this tension between two expressions that have been used by criminologists and certain political scientists, which is two visions of the police. The police as a state within the state, that is, in a way, they would escape the authority of the state. There would be that's the thesis of the insularity and autonomy of the police, state within a state. But you have the symmetrical dimension, which is or description, which is to think of the police as the armed wing of the state. And in that case, you insist on the contrary, on the fact that it is included in the state, but it is also dependent from the government. And in a way, you could think that the two are incompatible. So you cannot be the state within the state, autonomous, and the armed wing of the state, meaning that you're dependent from the initiatives of the government. But in fact, in the kind of situation that I've been describing, you see that there's a combination of the two. Because on the one hand, you have for sure the police that is increasingly given prerogatives and rights to repress with no consequence, with impunity in case of violence and brutality. But on the other hand, you have governments, very often from the right or far, or with or without far right support, but also increasingly the left. The law I described earlier was passed by under a socialist government in France, and so so you have the combination of the two dimensions. You have on the one hand the police, which has this discretionary power, and on the other hand, you have the government, which is expecting the police to be acting in this way. So I will stop here, and I'm open to your comments, your questions and criticism, of course. And again, you can make them in Spanish if you feel more comfortable, and I'll try to respond the best I can. And if I miss something, I will ask you to repeat. But thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Fassan, for your presentation. And I would like to open the floor now for questions and comments. And as Professor Fassan mentioned, si quieren hacer las preguntas en español, son muy bienvenidas. Lo único que pediríamos es que las preguntas fueran tan cortas como fuera posible para que muchas personas pudieran participar en el debate. Por favor, si quieren hacer preguntas o comentarios, levanten la mano, hagan clic en la manito para que podamos ordenar la conversación. Andrea Beltrán, por favor. No, tiene que abrir su micrófono, por favor.
Okay. Bueno, buenas tardes, muchas gracias. Merci beaucoup, profesor Fassan. Es muy chévere tenerlo acá. Voy a hacer mi pregunta en español, pero la podría hacer también en inglés. En el artículo de 2019, La policía es el castigo, The Policy is the Punishment, usted sostiene que la violencia policial constituye un castigo porque está protegida por el Estado, digamos que está respaldada por el Estado, ¿cierto? Porque el Estado respalda a los agentes de las consecuencias legales. En este otro artículo de 2024, The Politics of Aftermath, usted muestra cómo las respuestas del Estado pues, a la brutalidad policial pueden variar. Pueden ser incoherentes, a veces ofrecen protección, a veces no, o varía. ¿Usted cree que esta fluidez en el soporte institucional a la brutalidad policial desafía la noción de que el apoyo institucional puede ser un criterio para definir el castigo más allá de lo legal? Porque es variable, es fluida. Porque si, por ejemplo, nos encontramos, digamos, que las cosas cambian y que la brutalidad policial se vuelve algo realmente sancionado legalmente, entonces esto dejaría de ser un criterio para reconocer el castigo o dejaría la brutalidad policial de ser relevante como objeto de estudio a los que nos interesamos en el castigo. Muchas gracias.
¿Prefieren que conteste inmediatamente o que...
Sí, por favor, creo que eso sería lo mejor para no olvidar la pregunta.
Okay. So I will switch to English. So usually it is considered that the police is not the one that punishes, and under the definition of punishment under the legal philosophy and legal theory, the punishment can be inflicted only by institution and agents which have the legal authority to punish. What I've tried to show in this article, previous article you were referring to, is that the police also punish, and that even often the experience of people, their experience with the repressive system, let's say, in general, is much more frequent as a punishment by the police than a punishment by the judges. And so, of course, that was that was a paraphrase of a famous book, "The Process is the Punishment," in which the author was showing that in the United States, the final decision by a court was the exception in the punishment, and the long process from the arrest to the negotiation of a punishment by of a sanction of a sentence by with the prosecutor, this long process, which is administrative, bureaucratic, policed, with some phases of custody, etc. This was the majority of the punishment, instead of something that was given by the judge. And this is also what I've tried to show about the police, because very often it is described that the police are may be violent. In fact, they deny being violent. They say they use the force, and to prove that there is violence, you have to show in the French system, in the French legal system, that it is unjustified or excessive. Unjustified, for example, if someone is already is already shackled, there's no necessity to be violent, and excessive if someone has committed a petty crime and is beaten to death or to severe wounds. This is in excess. But it is not considered as punishment by society, by definition, by the law. Yet, for the victims themselves, they understand that it's a punishment, and even more, the police themselves think of it as a form of punishment. First of all, because they think the person they have in front of them is a culprit, and even if he's not a culprit, he has committed something else before for which he was not taken in, so he deserves what he gets. But also because they think that the judges will be too flexible, too generous, and will not will free them afterwards. So the punishment in the street becomes something. So that was my argument against, I would say, the definition by legal theory and legal philosophy of, and not that I would be against the fact that they would have this definition, but I would be against the idea that this definition corresponds to the reality. Now, I'm not sure I understand completely your question about, and maybe you will have to make some complement, but in the case of that was in the article, the Niles death, I think the idea of a punishment is less perhaps in the act itself than in the interpretation of the act. The interpretation by the politician, by the police themselves, the political authorities, by the media commenting on it, and broadly by society. So this young man, with this the description of his past, which is largely false, and of his act, which is true but a minor offense, becomes someone who is guilty. And there's this tendency to think that if you're guilty, you deserve the punishment that will be inflicted on you. And so it's not necessary that at the moment when the police officer is shooting at the young man that the punishment can be that can be recognized as such, but that is in the attitude and comments of the police in general, the institution, the politicians, the courts as well, and in the end, the society as a whole. But I'm not sure I answered correctly to your question, Andrea.
Muy bien, muchas gracias, profesor Fasán. ¿Otras preguntas, comentarios? Por favor, no olviden levantar la mano para poder ordenar la conversación, simplemente para que yo me dé cuenta de quién quiere participar. Bueno, mientras se van calentando motores y se van animando a hacer preguntas y comentarios, quisiera, profesor Fasán, hacer un par de preguntas que están interrelacionadas, que tienen que ver con un concepto que me parece particularmente interesante y es el de la economía moral de las multitudes. Entonces, en abstracto, creo que la categoría puede ser útil para cuestiones descriptivas y cuestiones analíticas y sería suficiente, sería una herramienta poderosa para comprender los procesos de creación, de circulación, de intercambio de valores con respecto a hechos sociales. Pero me pregunto por la utilidad normativa de la categoría en abstracto y también el uso que usted le da a la categoría en el artículo, ¿cierto? Porque por momentos en el artículo parecería que la tracción de la categoría es descriptiva y analítica, ¿cierto? Es decir, no es solo violencia, hay violencia, pero esa violencia tiene un significado político poderoso. Pero por momentos también parecería que la categoría en el artículo tiene un valor normativo, ¿cierto? Cuando se hace la diferencia entre motín y revuelta o motín y rebelión. Y parecería que entonces ahí hay un elemento normativo que resulta relevante también cuando se lee en el contexto de todo el texto, ¿cierto? Y su posición política frente a los abusos de la policía. Pero la cuestión sería, bueno, si tiene un papel normativo, ¿cuál sería? ¿Qué iluminaría y qué oscurecería y cuáles serían, digamos, las potencialidades de la categoría? Y el segundo elemento relacionado con este tiene que ver es con si efectivamente la categoría tiene relevancia normativa y si en el contexto del artículo esa relevancia tiene que ver con la diferencia entre motín y revuelta. Sería relevante también entonces distinguir entre violencia que tiene contenido político que daña la propiedad y violencia que tiene contenido político que daña a las personas. Y si eso entonces también permitiría hacer unas distinciones que serían también descriptiva, analítica y normativamente relevantes.
Muchas gracias por su pregunta y veo que Manuel también quiere hacer una pregunta. Pero muchas gracias, es muy interesante su pregunta y voy a tratar de responder lo mejor que puedo. Going back to English. So first of all, as you may know, I've worked a lot on the question of moral economy, and I have expanded and transformed the initial influential definition by E.P. Thompson. And E.P. Thompson was really referring to what he called moral economy was a form of economy that is exchange or production, circulation, exchange of goods or services. So economic in the classical or in the current sense. And he was kind of hesitant about the word moral, because he said in 20 years later, he said, maybe I should not have used the word moral because it's not about values. I should have maybe called it social economy rather. So he was not comfortable with the idea of value. He was more about norms, and about affects, anger, indignation. And I have tried to expand the notion of moral economy and to recenter it on the moral dimension. So not necessarily on the production, circulation, and exchange of goods or services, but also the production, circulation, and exchange of values and affects. And we can consider, from a sociological perspective, that there's a circulation, the production, circulation, and exchange of these two dimensions, the values and affects, which are very interrelated. If you think of compassion, for example, or indignation, there's a value dimension, refusal of suffering in one case, refusal of injustice in the other, but as values, but on the other hand, you have also the affective, the emotional dimension that is attached to it. So this is my understanding today, and the way I work with moral economy, in this broad sense of having to do with values and affects. So as you said, I think it has a certain relevance, or at least for me it has, to understand what's going on in certain situations. And I've studied that on punishment. I've studied that on immigration. I've studied that on the question of violence. And so what could be the normative dimension, as you ask? So first of all, I would say that as a social scientist rather than a legal scholar or a philosopher, I try not to be normative as typically, in the sense of saying this is what ought to be done or what we ought to do, which I think is completely legitimate. It's not what usually sociologists, anthropologists, historians do. But of course, what I try to do is to be critical, and the critical thinking opens on normative elements, of course, and I'm aware of that, and so when I say that there's a moral economy, it can be seen as a way of not exactly justifying, but at least understanding in a way that would transform the understanding the violence, the reaction of people in front of the killing of someone, one of them, reacting in a way, understanding in a way that does not justify, does not legitimize as such, but gives a comprehension of that is not a condemnation. So it's so in a way it's a form of rejection of the negative normativity that there is in condemnation or denunciation of these young men as violent or irrational, etc. Not to replace it by justification or legitimization, but at least by canceling in a way the negative look that we have on their practice. So here, I think the understanding, as I take it, the understanding and comprehension through moral economy, which means that what they are defending is also values, and what they are expressing is affects, is a way of so it's a critical approach, but at the same time it opens to a less judgmental approach to what happens. Now, you suggest that there would be a difference between persons and property. I'm not completely sure of that, and I would not defend that idea. Although, of course, there's probably a hierarchy between the two. So let's say that the police will stop someone and take the car because there was, drugs in the car, for example. They take an example that I've been working on. They take the car, so they take the property, and they shoot the guy. Of course, it will be considered as more serious to have shot at someone rather than have taken his car. But I think in both cases there would be a form of indignation. So then there's a graduation when there's a slap on the face of a young man. It's first of all by a police officer. It's relatively common, and there will not be protests. But taking life is really something that gets to another level. So it's not so much a question of the person or the property. I would suggest that it's a question of taking life that makes this normative switch, so to speak. But you're right to insist on, and we can. I think it's more interesting to analyze the debate about, is it a riot or is it a revolt? It's more interesting to analyze it and to see the arguments on both sides, rather than simply to say, well, this is a revolt and not a riot, or this is a riot and don't take it as a revolt. So again, I think it is more interesting to say that when Le Monde, Libération, mainstream newspaper speak of riots, which is the most common term to speak of these events of unrest, there is it is considered to be the normal way of designating these events. When Mediapart and others and critical thinkers say, well, we should speak of revolts, it is to reintroduce the idea of moral economy, of values and affects values that they defend and affect that they express, and so it politicizes the interpretation. So that's what I find interesting. It's this politicization, one that is an invisible politicization, and the other one that is an explicit politicization. So invisible is the riot, and the explicit is the revolt.
Muchas gracias. Mientras, no sé si Manolo pregunta, sí, mientras no solo un comentario de vuelta para continuar la conversación. Yo estoy de acuerdo en que tal vez la diferencia entre propiedad y vida o integridad personal no es muy interesante si se habla desde la perspectiva de la acción de la policía con respecto a la persona, sino con respecto al valor político y al valor político de la acción de la multitud y al valor normativo de la categoría de economía moral, ¿cierto? Porque yo estoy de acuerdo que es importante diferenciar entre violencia sin sentido política y violencia que tiene sentido político. Y estoy de acuerdo con su punto en la respuesta sobre, tal vez entonces no se trata, claro, de justificar la violencia o de estar de acuerdo con todo lo que la multitud hace, pero sí con una calificación negativa de la manera como se caracteriza por parte de la derecha o de los medios masivos de comunicación de lo que hace la multitud. Pero en esa comprensión, que tiene un elemento moral, parecería que sí es relevante la diferencia entre el daño que la multitud causa luego de que se indigna a la propiedad y el daño que la multitud causa a la persona luego de que a las personas, digamos, luego de que se indigna. Parecería que esa diferencia ahí sí es relevante y genera, digamos, una discusión un poco más texturada sobre el valor normativo de la categoría de economía moral.
Sí.
Manuel, tal vez.
Oh,
No, tal vez que conteste el profesor Fassan y después pregunto yo.
sí, voy a tratar de contestar rápidamente. So it's obviously an important aspect, and you're right to insist on the fact that uh, uh, the damage to property has been crucial in the indignation of, so not of the youth, which is what I was talking about before, the protest, but of society as a whole. So there has been the damage, which are evaluated at 1 billion euros, which is probably too excessive, but there's a lot of damage, and so there's the moment when society, and especially on television, you don't see anymore the young man being killed, but you see the stores being looted, you see the cars being burnt, and people identify with these even when they are not on the right, when they're, the average French person will identify with the situation where their car could be burned or their store could be looted. And so the question of the property, I think, is an important normative element, or is constructed as normative, and even, and that's perhaps one of the unbalance that there is. On the one hand, the main problem for society is the damage to property, while for the youth protesting, the main damage is the killing of one of them. So life and the integrity of the person. So here, I think you're right to insist on this, or to suggest this distinction between the two. And just one footnote to what you said at the beginning of your second part of the question, when you were talking about the politicization or the political dimension of a protest. And this is something that is very interesting, because in the end, the question is, what is political? And we've seen that in 2005, when we had the most important riots or revolts that we had, even more than for time of Naël, which is national revolt or riots, urban unrest, after the death of two adolescents who had been burnt in an electric transformer while being chased by the police. And so there was first the death of these two kids who were innocent. The fact that the Minister of the Interior of the time, Nicolas Sarkozy, had said that they were guilty of a crime, which was untrue. So second injustice, not only do they die, but instead of expressing compassion, you accuse them of something they have not done. And third, there was the grenade that was thrown, the police say by mistake, other do not believe it was by mistake, in a mosque, while Muslims were praying. So it's the combination of the three which suddenly become gives a reaction everywhere. And of course, when kids, when I say kids, I mean mostly adolescent or young men, when they start burning cars, destroying police stations, attacking the fighters, etc. Of course, it's not political in the usual sense of organizing oneself to defend ideas through an organization, etc. And the whole question was whether it was political or not political. And some said it was not political. It was mere affective reaction against. And that's where I think the moral economy can help understand what's going on. Others said, especially some Bourdieusian colleagues said it is a proto-political. So what is a proto-political is a whole question. For me, it was, and I would say from an anthropological perspective, it was political. It was political, although it was not in the usual framework of what we think of politics. But of course, the whole question is, what do we, so I'm not saying it, for me, it was political, but I'm not saying that I'm right. I'm saying that there's a debate and a discussion which has for reason of being that we've defined the political in different ways.
Muchas gracias. Manuel.
Bueno, muchas gracias por la presentación, profesor Fasán. Muy interesante. Un poco conectando con lo que venían discutiendo con Daniel y centrándome en la última parte de su artículo y de su presentación. Pues lo que usted dice resuena mucho en América Latina. Creo que es una buena razón por la cual lo invitamos y es porque es una situación que se está presentando en nuestra región y también no es una novedad para nosotros porque se ha venido presentando durante mucho tiempo. Y hay una discusión que usted plantea de, bueno, ¿la policía es un Estado dentro del Estado o es el brazo armado del Estado? No, más bien es una combinación de ambos. Y eso está explicado por esa combinación se explica a partir del autoritarismo. Y yo creo que ese es un término que usamos mucho en la región para definir a nuestros regímenes políticos y nuestros estados. Yo quisiera preguntarle, y bueno, y usted también comenta en el artículo, Sudáfrica ha sido definida como una democracia violenta. Tal vez deberíamos pensar que este tipo de categoría no aplica solo al sur global, sino también al norte global. Yo quisiera preguntarle si elabora un poco más esto, si lo que usted está queriendo nos decir es, esto comienza a ser un rasgo preocupantemente común de los estados europeos, pues usted menciona explícitamente Francia, los Estados Unidos o los países del norte global. Si este es un rasgo que usted cree que es permanente, que está delineando una nueva forma de régimen político, o cuál es su preocupación en ese aspecto. Uno también piensa en lo igual cuando habla del Estado penal neoliberal donde, digamos, este control violento de las minorías o de los marginalizados es un rasgo permanente del Estado, o usted está pensando en otro tipo de categorías para definir lo que está pasando actualmente en Europa y Estados Unidos?
Sí, bueno, es una pregunta difícil e importante al mismo tiempo. So first of all, I don't have a teleological view on these kind of things. So I'm not, I would not say we are in a process that is going in that direction for. At the same time, I'm very interested and concerned also as a citizen about social change and political change. Which echoes exactly what you're saying. So I think we are in a moment in many countries of authoritarian turn, which is visible both in the restriction of fundamental rights and prerogatives of the police, to give these two examples. And and I think it is a trend. I'm not saying that it will that it's a inevitable logic that would take us somewhere to dictatorship or something like that. But there's something about authoritarianism that is extremely strong in the global north at the moment, and of course in many countries in the global south as well. But that was perhaps a little less new, and more fluctuant as well. And in the case of of Europe and France in particular, I would say, so I will start with France, and I think there's a connection between the neoliberal turn, or neoliberal, not turn because it's not new, but the neoliberal expansion and the authoritarian element. And the case of France for me is very typical, because we have a president who is by training a banker, and which is what's happening now in Canada as well. And who knew something, whether we share his ideology or not, knew something about economics and about economies and about finance more specifically, but had no idea about democracy, about citizenship, about how to deal with governing a population in a Foucauldian sense. And and so as long as he was dealing with taxes and other and finance and economy, and trying to facilitate the economic activity of the big companies, etc., he was comfortable. When there started to be protests, first of all against the reform of the pensions, and second what was called the Yellow Vest movement, then he was in the incapacity of knowing how to react, except to call the police, and this gave more power to the police, and in a certain way an abandonment of the authority, which was replaced by the authoritarianism. Authority, as in an Arendtian sense, as what makes you being respected without the use of force, to what makes you being respected through the use of force. And so I think that's a typical element. And the other element that I want to add to that is that currently the opinion polls, and we can have all the discussion we want to have about opinion polls, but some of them which are relatively serious because they have been done over the years, every year, the one by Sciences Po in Paris, center of Sciences Po, they show that there's a notable increase, that is a majority of the population saying that they want a stronger executive power, and that they would have no problem of reducing human rights and fundamental rights if it were to have more order. And more order with even losing some of their prerogatives to have more a more efficient, as they would say, government, because it would be more authoritarian. And so I think there's this trend. And so that's a country like France, and not even speaking of the United States, where we see that, I mean, even before the coming to power of Trump, of Donald Trump, it was already there was already something about the hardening of the repression against the protesters, even very peaceful protesters. So, but my impression, and this would have to be developed more seriously, but I remember a few years ago when we had debates, or not debates, but conversation with colleagues from the Netherlands or from Germany about the police. They would say, we don't understand your police. You know, it's so violent. They are so violent. The way the kind of repression they use against protesters is something that we don't understand, because that's not the way we do. And I think there's also a tendency in these countries at the moment, not as much as in France, but still to have a hardening also of police action. So, and of course, this is in a context of the rise of the far right. When you think that even countries like Sweden are in a process of far right representing not only nationalism and populism, whatever that means, but also authority and authoritarianism, and even the Chantal Mouffe's model of the populist, and which she thinks should be a left populist, but is very often in Europe a right populist. But with the idea that there would be a one man, one woman, but mostly one man being in power and imposing its power. So I wouldn't say that's a change in regime, but it's a coming of age, so to speak, of authoritarianism in many so-called democratic countries that are less and less democratic, including mine.
Muchas gracias. Preguntas, comentarios, por favor, solo levanten la mano si están en pantalla o... muy bien. Mauricio Manchado, por favor. Por favor, Mauricio, no olvide activar su micrófono.
Ahí está. Buenas tardes, ¿qué tal? Bueno, muchas gracias al profesor Facén por la presentación. Particularmente un poco ligando esto de los nexos entre el sur y el norte global, también quería hacerle una pregunta al profesor en relación a algo que no está dicho en el texto, pero que tal vez ha sido observado o analizado, y que está sucediendo de alguna manera en Argentina, que es de donde hablo, con respecto a casos donde hay policías acusados del ejercicio de la violencia institucional, policías inclusive que transitan procesos judiciales y muchos de ellos inclusive son condenados, donde hay una suerte de aparición de nuevos actores en los reclamos, inclusive sobre esas condenas a policías, que son, por ejemplo, la familia de los propios policías, porque en el texto el profesor Facén hace mención a la diferencia que existió entre una propuesta de recaudar dinero para el joven asesinado y una propuesta de recaudar dinero para el policía acusado de esos asesinatos, con una diferencia inclusive en términos de los montos recaudados bastante significativo, que uno podría hacer una lectura simbólica en torno a las diferencias que el profesor señala en el texto. Y esto en Argentina se viene observando respecto de, bueno, algunos actores que empiezan a tratar de restituir este accionar policial, de algún modo, no sé si justificándolo, pero dando a entender que efectivamente no es un accionar incorrecto, o que inclusive lo que está sucediendo es justamente un acto de injusticia sobre los policías, porque hubo una suerte de avance de un discurso progresista que termina avasallando los derechos de los propios policías. Entonces, esto es un poco el argumento que se sostiene en muchas de estas protestas, inclusive de familias que se han empezado a denominar la familia azul, ¿no? Y que salen inclusive a ocupar el espacio público, algo que es un tanto novedoso también, al menos para el caso de Argentina. Y la pregunta puntual es si en el caso que el profesor observa, hay algo así como lo que viene sucediendo acá, que es una suerte de reinvención del lenguaje de los derechos humanos, ahora en clave de inscribirlo en la protesta de estos agentes de la policía. Es decir, en Argentina viene sucediendo que el repertorio que históricamente utilizaron, el repertorio estético político que utilizaron los organismos de derechos humanos para dar cuenta de la violación de los derechos humanos, ya sea tanto durante las épocas de dictadura militar, pero también en los casos de violencia institucional ya recuperada la democracia, es de alguna manera reutilizado y resignificado por estos agentes policiales o por sus familias, justamente para discutir desde ese mismo repertorio. Y de alguna manera lo que terminan haciendo es poner en escena un lenguaje de los derechos humanos que históricamente estuvo tal vez asignado justamente a aquellos actores que protestaban o discutían el accionar del Estado, pero ahora lo hacen agentes que son del propio Estado y que además cometen estas acciones como la que describe el texto, que tiene que ver no solamente con los excesos y los abusos, sino con todo un repertorio simbólico que avala ese ejercicio, y a la vista está, digamos, esta suerte de emergente de una recaudación, por ejemplo, en favor de la policía o del policía acusado, dando a entender que ahí hay también un basamento social para avalar algunas prácticas. Entonces, mi pregunta puntual es si en este caso que el profesor observó, también reconoce que hay una suerte de apelación al lenguaje de los derechos humanos por parte de un actor, como la policía, que históricamente no estuvo vinculado con ese lenguaje.
Muy bien, muchas gracias.
Sí, es una pregunta muy, muy interesante y que creo tiene muchos aspectos que voy a tratar de discutir más allá del caso de Nael. So to go back to English, I think there's a general phenomenon of appropriation of the language, I would say, the moral language in general, and the language of human rights in particular, by those who have been seen as violating morality and human rights. So, and this is a very powerful move, and it has very broad dimensions. And I would just make a parenthesis because that's not the topic of the day, but you see that today in Israel, in the way of that many have, those who support the government and its war, making the massacres of people as a moral act, and reversing, for example, the question of the human shields, using human shields, but accusing the others to do so. And so there's I have colleagues, Niv Gordon and his co-author in Israel, who have studied precisely this question of using the language of human rights on the side of those who are using violence, and again, not wanting to intervene in this current situation on which I've been working and writing a book that's going to be translated in Spanish, by the way, by Siglo XXI, on the war in Gaza. But I closed the parenthesis, and I think that is something that is quite interesting to see this appropriation, and I think there are at least two dimensions to it. Just trying to think with your question, two dimension. One which is strategic, and the other which is, I would say, more more spontaneous, I would say. So the strategic one, I think, comes from, in part, from the head of the police. So the communication, those in charge of communication in particular. I've been struck when I did my field work on the police. I've been struck with one thing in that domain. In 2005, when we had these riots or revolts in France, national, we never heard about the police being wounded. 2 years later, there were other riots or revolts locally after the death of two other kids, but it remained local. And immediately, the police prefect and the Minister of the Interior, their public service, their communication with the media, immediately started to count the number of police officers who had been hurt or wounded. And in a few hours, it was an extraordinary increase in numbers. And for me, that was a sign of an evolution which changed the presentation of the police as from a situation where in 2005 they were supposed to be not exactly invincible, but at least there was the masculinity of police. You will not talk about them as victims. In 2007 and since then, all the time you have interaction, you have the counting, protest or whatever. You have the counting of police officers being wounded and injured. And in one case that I've studied in particular, I remember after an interaction with the inhabitants in a neighborhood where I was working, the trade union had spoken about terrible violence against the police, who had several of them having been badly hurt, etc. And a few days later, I went to see the police officers who were concerned, and I asked them who was, because I knew them, so who was hurt, and one of them running hurt his ankle. And that was the only one. And suddenly, so this, beyond the fact that we can, of course, have some problems with this, the way the police are describing themselves, but more interesting for our point of view is to see this complete change, and this complete change in the moral imagination, or the moral imagination, let's call it this way, of the police, has political implication. Because when you start to describe the police as victims, then you can justify their repression in a different way. And in a time when victims are have become a positive word, a positive notions, when you can describe yourself as victim of something, whether it's sexual abuse or the oppression of the state, or it has a positive connotation for most people. The fact that the police would enter that realm is something I think very important. And also, so that's on the moral dimension. But in your question, there's also the legal dimension. So if you claim the defense of human rights, if you claim this domain that is moral by a certain aspect, but legal as legal implication, then this appropriation makes complete sense from their perspective. So instead of being the violator of the law, of the human rights, there are those who are victims of the violation of their own rights. So I think this is and in a context, in a climate of increasing inequalities with stigmatization of certain groups. So in Argentina, the sectores populares, and including some with coming from other countries, immigrants from Venezuela or from Bolivia or wherever. So, in this context, many people are attracted to the form of authority that the police represent, and presenting them as not only as defending human rights, but victims themselves of their own rights is something that is that is important. I remember on a different the two aspects of being victims of their own rights and being defending human rights. On the second aspect, which was maybe not in your question, but I remember one of my colleague working in Turkey was explaining how at the time when Turkey wanted to enter the European Union, one of the criteria was to ask Turkey to train their police with human rights. So she attended these training classes for the police officers for human rights, done by European, I don't know, legal scholars or activists. And what was striking in her observation was, there was this class, and when they were having coffee afterwards, they were showing all the disdain, the scorn that they had toward this question. So they were supposed to incorporate human rights, but they didn't believe it at all. And that's what we see in the past few days. We see that the police in Turkey are not those who are defending human rights. But yeah, I think your point is a very important one, to look at the moral and legal appropriation by the police of the discourse which comes from the left, basically. And the discourse, whether it's of compassion for the victims on the moral dimension, or the human rights on the legal dimension. So yeah, I see that one of your, I don't know, someone has written about preparing an article and asking me to read that article in the chat. So what I can say is that I like to read students' papers, but I have my limitation in terms of time, and so I don't want to refuse, but I cannot promise to do very much either. I think there's a last question, maybe, or.
Sí, muy bien. Jan, creo que podemos recibir la última pregunta.
Yeah.
Lady Natalia, por favor. Por favor, no olvide activar su micrófono.
Listo. Hola, mucho gusto. Mi nombre es Lady Cadena. Yo no tengo una pregunta, quería hacer más bien un comentario. Y es pues para el profesor decirle que me sorprendió profundamente cuando leí el artículo. Yo fui víctima de violencia policial en Colombia durante la manifestación del 2021, en abril. Un policía me disparó directamente en mi ojo derecho, lo perdí completamente la visión en mi ojo derecho. No fue un accidente, claramente fue un tiro limpio y con daño, con intención de daño. Perdí el ojo y a pesar de que existen también pruebas y un video, eh, el policía sigue en sus funciones y nunca ha enfrentado pues consecuencias reales. Debido a amenazas, yo tuve que salir de Colombia, yo me encuentro en el exilio. Y mientras leía su análisis, vi reflejado un patrón que me representa: la criminalización de nosotras las víctimas, la construcción de una narrativa para justificar la violencia policial y la impunidad, la ley. La forma en la que describe la economía moral y todos estos eventos donde se protege pues a los perpetradores y nos descalifica o nos desacredita a quienes sufrimos violencia es algo que pues yo he experimentado de primera mano, y su artículo no solo expone pues con claridad cómo opera el sistema de represión y encubrimiento del Estado, sino que también pues da cuenta de una realidad que trasciende pues las fronteras. Yo sé que usted escribe un caso en Francia, pero esto no es distinto de lo que ocurre en América Latina, en Colombia y en muchos otros pues países. Es no solo doloroso ver que es un modelo de impunidad que se repite a nivel global, sino también es para todos un recordatorio de que nuestra lucha por la verdad y la justicia es algo pues global. Le agradezco pues por su trabajo y por poner esto en palabras que tantas víctimas pues hemos vivido. Y ya,
Muchas gracias.
de nada.
Muchas gracias por su testimonio y análisis también. Um, Creo que desafortunadamente su caso es uno de los muchos casos de los que han sido heridos por la policía y sin, sin ninguna sin ninguna sanción what do you say, punishment,
Sí.
castigo, sí, castigo. Um, y, por ejemplo, he trabajado sobre un caso, un libro que no ha sido traducido en español, que es, creo que no, sobre el caso de un Roma gitano. ah, que fue matado por la unidad más especial de la gendarmería, los que actúan en casos de terrorismo, etcétera. Y este tipo que nunca ha atacado o asaltado a ninguna persona fue matado por y la y entonces conozco a la familia, conozco al caso, he estudiado todos los documentos legales que han sido producidos, son muchos. Y, y he podido demostrar que la versión de la policía que él tenía un cuchillo que estaba tratando de asaltar la policía, que tenían armas increíbles y esta policía. Y, y entonces la justicia dio razón a la policía. Y ahora con mi libro, o ciertos capítulos de mi libro, el caso se encuentra en las manos de, de las manos de la European Court of Human Rights. Y, y espero que el resultado será positivo para la verdad, lo que para mí es la verdad, porque no sería la cuestión a este momento, no habrá ningún castigo a los policías, pero podría haber una condenación de Francia por su policía y por su justicia. Y eso tendría una significación, un sentido mucho más amplio que simplemente un policía que ha matado a un joven. Entonces, su testimonio y su análisis son muy importantes y le agradezco por su comentario.
Muy bien, bueno, desafortunadamente se nos acabó el tiempo, pero quisiera agradecer a la audiencia por su participación, a las muchas preguntas y comentarios, y al profesor Fasán por haber aceptado nuestra invitación y por esta rica conversación sobre un tema que es de interés común. Muy amables, los esperamos entonces en la próxima sesión de nuestro seminario permanente. Ojalá puedan asistir. Muchas gracias. Buena tarde.